All right, hello everybody. So today we're going to be talking about Chapter 5, Arousal, Stress, and Anxiety. It's a pretty important chapter because the next 2-3 weeks it's sort of all going to be related, right? So we're going to talk about sort of the foundations of what arousal and anxiety is, what the stress process is today, and theories that go behind it. And then in the next couple of weeks, we're going to talk about burnout and overtraining, which is very much related to stress. And then 2 weeks from now, we're going to be talking about arousal regulation. So more of that practical application of what do you do to regulate your arousal levels so that you can perform the best you can. Okay, so pretty important chapter. There's quite a few things that you will definitely need to know about the test, for the test, so please pay attention. Okay, so first we're going to start with defining what arousal and anxiety is. A lot of the times you can sort of see that these terms are used interchangeably, and that is mostly because we're trying to get rid of this negative stigma about what anxiety is, right? So normally when you hear someone has high anxiety, it's very debilitating and negative. In the sports psych world, when you're dealing with athletes, you're trying to get rid of that, trying to say like, hey, you might have this anxiety, but you can definitely deal with it and you can learn to use it to your advantage. Okay, so again, if you're talking about the real world here, we're trying to sort of say that these two things are the same. However, for the sake of this class, they are going to be separate things, and you're going to see in just a second that anxiety is that sort of negative aspect of arousal. Okay, so arousal. What is arousal? It's a blend of both physiological, so physical, and psychological activation. And you'll see in the next slide that this can vary along a continuum, right? So you have really, really low arousal on one side and then really, really high arousal on the other. And we'll see in just a second what that can look like. And then anxiety. So as I mentioned, we have this negative emotional state that you associate with this activation, this arousal in your body, right? So when you start to feel, clammy hands, sweaty hands, rapid heartbeat, how are you associating that with your thoughts, right? Is it negative? Is it positive? When it's negative, when you put those negative thoughts and feelings into what's happening to you physically, that is what becomes anxiety. Okay, so feelings of worry, nervousness, apprehension, those negative thoughts and feelings that come with arousal. Okay, so as I mentioned, here is that continuum, and here's what your different levels of arousal can look like. You'll see that on the left side, you have deep, deep sleep, where there's little to no arousal really happening. You're not aware of it. It's there, like you're obviously alive, so there's something happening there, but you are unaware of it. And then as you can see, it moves to drowsy, then this feeling of relaxed. As you get higher, you're more alert. And then to the right, to the very end, you see this extreme excitement. And this is usually those high levels of adrenaline, more of those exciting and extreme activated situations that you might be in. Your fight and flight response is also on this extreme end. So you can see that there is a continuum here. As an athlete, as a performer, you want to know what level of arousal is needed in that particular situation you're in, right? Which one will help you perform your best? Do you need to be relaxed? Do you need to be super excited? Where in that continuum? And we'll talk about this in quite a bit of detail in just a minute. Okay, so what exactly can make arousal turn into this anxiety? Like I said, everyone gets aroused at some point at any given point of the day. So when does that turn into anxiety? The answer is that stress is what can cause it to become negative. And so what exactly is stress? So stress is an imbalance between demands that you have in front of you and your own individual capacity to handle those demands, essentially. So you have physical, psychological demands. Let's say when you're going into a competition, let's say you are playing someone who is extremely difficult, maybe they're number one in the nation, and you are playing them, and maybe your own capacity to play, you don't feel like you can beat them, right? So those demands, the demands become very, very high, and your capacity and capability to meet those demands are down low. So when that happens, that is when you get stress. And we all know you can have stress in any setting, right? It doesn't have to be just competition. If you have a test and you know that the demands are this high, but your studying was this much in terms of your ability to respond to that exam. So that becomes stress, as opposed to if you study a lot and you feel like you have that capability, then the demands are manageable and easy, right? So then you're able to handle that stress. Okay, so now we're going to be talking about stress response. So what is this stress response? It's basically the way you interpret a situation, right? So it's your body's mental, emotional, and physiological response to a situation that you either view as new, exciting, threatening, frightening. We call this appraisal of a situation. The way you appraise a situation is how you perceive that particular event. And so here in stage 1, you can see that first you have your environmental demands put in front of you. It can be physical, psychological, whatever the situation is you're in. That's stage 1. Stage 2 is what I mentioned before, which is the appraisal part of the situation. This is how you perceive the demand to be. Is the amount of physiological or physical demands, is it a threat that you feel like you can't respond to or you can't meet the demands of? Or is it maybe a challenge that you know you can beat and you know you can do this, right? It's exciting, it's new, but you feel like you can handle it. So being able to appraise the situation positively is likely to give you a stress response that's more positive, right? So here we see stage 3. Now, after you've appraised the situation, you have your stress response. And again, this can be physical and psychological. So maybe you appraise the situation as something you can handle, so it's not as stressful. So now you're excited, right? You have high arousal, but it's more excitement rather than anxiety or those negative emotional states of worry and apprehension. Your stress response, like I said, can also be physical. So you might have muscle tension if you feel like it's super stressful and you can't handle it. And also attention changes. So your psychological response to things will also be affected if your stress response is more negative. We'll talk about attention changes in just a little bit. And then lastly, you have your behavioral consequences. So after you respond to your stress, you feel that in your body, you have a response, in your mind, you have a response. What is that going to make you do, right? How are you going to perform? What is the behavior that comes out of that? That all just depends on the person. And we'll talk about that in a second. But after the behavior happens, starts all over again, right? You're put into another situation and then it repeats the process. So those are the 4 stages of stress response. When your stress response is negative, that's when it turned into anxiety, right? So here we are back at anxiety. It's important to know that there are 2 types of anxiety. Okay, we have trait anxiety and state anxiety. And we talked about trait and state. It's very similar to what we talked about with confidence, about trait self-confidence and state like self-confidence, right? So trait, again, is this personality disposition where it's sort of just who you are, that you perceive situations in certain ways, right? Maybe you have high trait anxiety. And so really in most situations, you are likely to perceive or appraise that situation to be threatening, right? So you have constant high anxiety, as opposed to another person who has low trait anxiety. It might take a lot for a person to evaluate a situation to be threatening. That is just who you are. It's pretty permanent. So it's likely not going to change much from situation to situation. And then we have state anxiety. This is more of that fluid, changes per situation type of anxiety. It's how you feel in a particular moment in time, so very situational. And this is likely where competitive anxiety falls into place, right? If you are in a certain competitive situation, then you might get anxiety, but it's temporary. It'll go away eventually. And it, for the most part, can be dealt with. And also, just to make a note that there are two types of state anxiety, right? There's cognitive, so cognitive in your brain, thoughts that happen in your head, and then somatic state anxiety, so the physical aspect. Okay, so we are getting to the more important part of the chapter, which is the theories that go along with arousal and anxiety and how it affects performance. And so the way I'm going to explain these is going to be through graphs. So it'll be important for you to be able to distinguish between each one. There are there are 6 theories that you'll essentially need to know. So pay attention and just know what the graphs look like. That should make this easier to remember. Okay, so first we have drive theory here, and it's one of the earlier theories that people came up with in terms of the relationship between arousal and performance. And as you can see here, through drive theory, it is believed that as your arousal gets higher and higher, as you can see here on the y-axis, as it gets higher, then your performance level gets higher. The higher your arousal level, the better you are at performing. Here you can also see when your arousal is low, then your performance is low, and it must be high in order for you to perform well. So very simple relationship. As you can imagine, this probably isn't the most accurate because we know that there are people who, if their arousal is too high, then their performance may not necessarily be the best. And we'll see that in these other theories. So this is drive theory. It's a linear relationship, linear positive relationship. Okay, then we have here the inverted U hypothesis. As you can see here, similarly, as your arousal gets higher, your performance tends to get higher. But when you hit a certain point, here in the middle of the graph, you hit a certain point, and that is your most optimal arousal, right? So it's not necessarily very high. It's sort of right in between that you hit this optimal zone. After you hit this optimal zone here at the top, where your arousal is just right and your performance is high, then as you get higher, your level of performance gets lower and lower until you're at a point where it's too high and you just can't perform and function, right? So as arousal continues to increase, performance deteriorates in the steady fashion, right? It's sort of slow and gradual as you get higher in arousal states. Okay, so there's your inverted U hypothesis. This one is called the Individualized Zone of Optimal Functioning, or IZOF. This one is more individualized, right? It's in the name. It's basically saying that each person, each athlete has their own level of optimization of state anxiety that's optimal for their performance. As you can see here in the chart or in the graph, you have 3 different athletes, and each one performs best in these different IZOF zones. So athlete A, their best zone of performance is here on this low scale, versus if they're out of zone, they don't perform as well. Then you have athlete B, who's a moderate IZOF. And so as you can see, low does not work well for him. or her, and high does not work well for them, except right there in the middle is your optimized level of functioning. And then, as you can see, for athlete C, you have them performing best in the high IZOF or high state anxiety levels. Anything below a certain point, they are not going to be able to perform well. They must be in this high zone to perform best, right? So this is slightly different from inverted U, where it varies for each person, right? It's not necessarily everyone has this optimal zone right in the middle, right in between, but people perform best just depending on the person. And also, this optimal level of state anxiety is not necessarily just a single point on a graph like we saw in the inverted U point, right? Where it was just that top of the graph or the top of the line there. Here in IZOF, there's a bandwidth, right? There's a certain area, doesn't have to be just one point, it's a certain area on the continuum that allows them to perform best. All right, so this other theory is called the catastrophe or CUSP theory. This has to do with high or low cognitive anxiety. Here on the left side, you'll see that if you have low worry, low cognitive anxiety, your performance is likely to follow that inverted U curve. If you're not worrying too much, then your arousal follows this simple curve, right? There's the gradual decrease as it gets higher. However, if you have high cognitive anxiety, which is here on the right side, and you have high worry, then what's different about this theory is that rather than there being a gradual decrease in performance, you can see that here it essentially stops at a point and completely tanks. Like there's no gradual decrease. It's you perform well and then you start to perform bad and then it just goes bad, right? There's no sort of coming back from it. There's no slow down in performance. It's just completely disastrous, essentially. It's a catastrophe. Again, this is only for if you have that high worry, high cognitive anxiety. All right, so up next we have multidimensional model. This model is not as popular as the other ones. There's less support for this particular one, but here it is anyways. It's important. The graph is a little bit different and easier to remember, but what makes it multidimensional is that it takes into account both cognitive anxiety and the somatic anxiety, right? The physiological type of anxiety. There's two different points or two different linear models here. And so cognitive anxiety is negatively related to performance. So that worry, if your worry is low, then your performance will be high, right? So that's that top of the line here. And then as your worry gets higher and higher, your performance decreases. So that's that negative linear line. And then somatic anxiety is seen in this inverted U pattern. So it's very much what we saw with the inverted U hypothesis. If you have low somatic anxiety, physical anxiety, then you're likely to perform low, but there's this optimal level that you want to hit in order for you to perform at your highest. If it gets any higher than that, then there's this gradual decrease. With multidimensional model, there's this sort of sweet spot right here. That is your most optimal performance, right? You have somewhat still low cognitive anxiety right here, and then your somatic anxiety is at a point where you want it to be, where it's most optimal. So where that line crosses is essentially your most optimal performance, according to this multidimensional model. Okay, and then lastly, we have reversal theory. This essentially is just saying that it depends on the person and how they interpret the arousal and how it will affect their performance. If someone views their arousal as excitement and something pleasant that is able to facilitate performance, then they are likely to perform better. If someone views their arousal as unpleasant or negative and uncomfortable, then it is likely to hurt their performance. So really, it depends on the person and how they view the situation. So again, just like the last model, this is really interesting, but There's not enough studies to prove or to give enough support to say that this is actually true. Okay, so just a few thoughts about why we talk about arousal and these associations with performance and why we have these different theories. Arousal is a very multifaceted concept, right? There's a physical aspect to it, but there's also this psychological and cognitive aspect to it as well, right? And so it can be really complicated and be very individualized depending on the person because of these different components. Performers find the optimal mix of these emotions for their best performance. So this is what we do as sports psychology consultants. We help athletes find their most optimal zones, optimal interpretations of these events that help them to perform and use it to their strengths and to their advantage, right? Like I mentioned, it's very highly individual and it depends on the situation and the task at hand, those demands that is put in front of you. Arousal and state anxiety do not always have negative effects on performance, so they can be facilitative and positive for someone's performance, or they can be debilitative, which we discussed earlier, depending on how they view the situation. Self-confidence and enhanced perceptions of control are critical to perceiving anxiety as facilitative. This is sort of going back to that stress response, right? So how are you viewing the demands in front of you? And then how are you viewing yourself and your own capabilities? If you have this high self-confidence and believe you have high capability to meet these demands, then this anxiety is not going to be negative for you. It's going to help you in your performance. Some optimal level of arousal leads to peak performance, but optimal levels of physiological activation and arousal worry are not the same. So this is where we see sort of that breakdown of, oh, your cognitive worry can be really, really bad and detrimental, as opposed to your physical arousal, which can actually be helpful and not as detrimental to your performance. So there is that difference between the two. And just because you're optimal in one doesn't mean you're optimal in another. Like, it's not the same, it can be different. Interaction of physiological activation and arousal interpretation are more important than actual levels of each. This is sort of saying that how you think about something plus the physical reactions that you have is what equals your best performance, right? It's not quite just high here, high here. It's how those two interact depending on who you are as a person. So really quickly, just want to mention a couple reasons why arousal can influence performance and how it does that. One big one is muscle tension. Having anxiety, nervousness can create those tensions in our bodies, which, as you can imagine, can affect our movements, our energy levels during a performance. You can read a little bit about this throwing study here on what that looks like in high trait participants versus low trait participants. In the arousal regulation chapter, we will be talking about how to release that tension and do exercises to help with this. There can also be changes in attention, concentration, and visual search. A narrowing of attention happens when you have high anxiety. Maybe you can only focus on one thing. You sort of zero in and have tunnel vision. There's a decreased environmental scanning, a shift to your dominant style, attending to inappropriate cues. So maybe you get distracted easily and can't focus on what you need to focus on. Performance worries and situation irrelevant thoughts. So just things ruminating in your head that are not related to performance. And there's a difference in identification and processing of visual cues. So you think you see something and you try to make a play, but in reality, it wasn't there. And that's because you have these different levels of arousal that it essentially can be distracting to you or not helpful to your performance. And here's just a really good visual of what arousal can do to your attention. This is called the peripheral cue utilization. As you can see here at the top, you have your most optimal state, right? This is like the perfect amount of arousal and state anxiety. You're at the top of the inverted U here, so optimal. They use the example of a quarterback here. So in your optimal state, you have this really good view and focus of what you need to focus on in your particular play, and you are able to see what you need to see. When you get to this low arousal state and low state anxiety, now your attention focus is broad. Everything is in your vision. You can see everything. If you have this broad attentional focus, you can usually notice what's happening in the stands. You can notice what's happening outside of what you need to do. And so that can become very distracting, right? Your focus is just not there. It's too broad that you can't seem to focus on what you need to do. And then lastly, you have your high arousal and state anxiety, where you're sort of too much in terms of focus and vision. High arousal, you're worried that you're going to miss something. And so all you can see is what's directly in front of you. You have this tunnel vision and you are set on throwing the ball to this one person, one receiver, when really that's not what you want, right? You want to be able to see and make the right play for the right situation. If your arousal is too high and you have too much worry, then you're sort of focused in on just one thing. Okay, so again, really good visual here just to show the different states that you can be in and how that affects your focus. All right, and just really quickly, some implications for professional practice. After we learn about anxiety and stress, what can we do to help? One of the things that we can do is help athletes identify the optimal combinations of these arousal-related emotions for their best performance, right? And in this week's assignment, it's due in a couple weeks, you're going to do this for yourself. You're going to be finding your own IZOF for yourself and sort of go through the process of what that can look like. We can recognize how personal and situational factors interact to influence arousal, anxiety, and performance. Recognize signs of increased arousal and state anxiety. So knowing when someone is sort of getting too much arousal before games and how that's affecting them. And also maybe someone's not getting enough, right? Maybe it's too low. And so how do we increase that for those people? Tailor coaching strategies to individuals. Sometimes arousal must be reduced, other times maintained, other times facilitated. And that just goes with exactly what I just said, right? Knowing what that person needs in that situation. Develop confidence in performers to help them cope with increased stress and anxiety. This involves a lot of assurances for how to cope, making sure that performers have the right tools in these situations so that they can regulate their own physiological and psychological arousal. And again, we'll talk in a couple weeks about how we can regulate these arousal levels. And so just to leave you all hanging just a little bit, here's a slide that lists all the symptoms of arousal and state anxiety. If you get any of these before competition or a test or whatever situation, we'll be talking in 2 weeks about how we can help to regulate these arousal levels so that we can perform our best. So that is all for today. Again, make sure you know the theories. That's what's most important about this chapter, as well as the definitions of arousal, stress, and anxiety. So I will see you all next week.